grazing so greatly facilitates lengthening the grazing season.
Yes.
And shortening the feeding season.
Yes.
And sometimes eliminating the feeding season. And fed feed versus graze feed has tremendous economic significance. Adaptive grazing is going to have green growth happening throughout a longer portion of the year. And then if you learn how to stockpile as part of your grazing planning, you can get through a brief period where there may be nothing green for a little while.
I have seen far too many pastures that have been very closely cropped. In late August, we typically turn off hot and dry in many regions of the country. We're not sure of when we're going to get that next rain. It may be October, it may even be November. And so what's going to happen is those pastures that are cropped down tight now, that is a negative impact for the rest of this grazing season and will actually bleed in to next year's grazing season. And those pastures are going to require much earlier and much more heavy and prolonged winter feeding. And winter feeding is never cheap. It's always very expensive. So what we're doing here, the target with this graze, is to then get off of this, because we have a lot of cool season forages here, fescue and brome and so forth. So we want to get off of this and allow this to stockpile for winter grazing rather than hay feeding. So that stockpile allows us to be able to achieve those goals and objectives. Building soil, protecting our soil, and rapid regrowth for the stockpile, lowering our winter feeding cost, and protecting our soil and root reserves so that we get earlier growth coming back next spring. So we're actually significantly prolonging on both ends our grazing season. And that is our goal. Winter feeding is never cheap. And if we look at data from the IRM, or Integrated Resources Management Program, what we find is that on every beef cattle operation, between 73 and 85% of the total annual cost of production for a cow are in, guess what she eats. So if we can significantly lower those costs, then we have lowered the primary, by far, the primary area of cost in our beef cattle operations. So Steve and Judy, y'all have been here a while now, and initially you were managing this place very differently, and you had resource concerns. You were concerned about the amount of forage and the sequence of forage to get you through the year, and you were also concerned about the amount of hay that it was going to take you to make it through every winter. So how has your thought process evolved, and how have your practices evolved relative to where you were and what you're doing today?
Well, we were conventional in some ways. We were still rotating cattle. We were grazing much shorter and harder, but we put up quite a bit of hay. That's a big difference from what we do now. What really changed for us was when we sold the hay equipment. And even then, we still have custom haying done, and then we quit that as well. All of a sudden, you have a whole farm to manage in a season of when you were the type of person who sweated seed heads. How do you do that without bringing a lot of cattle in? And that's when the changes really started as far as taller grazing, not worrying so much about seed heads or even forbs that came up. We also rented land, and that was where we learned to strip graze with the polywire. We would stockpile fescue on these rented farms and then use the polywire to strip graze the cattle at higher densities. And we got where, I was the type who kind of liked to talk about how we don't feed any hay. Now we've evolved a little since then, and we will use hay at times to allow us to run more head for that spring green up and have some hungry mouths to graze all the growth we get, which we get a large percentage of our growth is before July 1st. But our hay reduction has gone way down. If we feed 45 days of hay, that's a lot. Back then when we were running cattle and strip grazing the stockpile fescue all winter, a week or two was as much as we would feed.